24:14, chapter 23, the story of movements and the spread of the gospel. Luke begins his book of Acts by telling us what Jesus began to do and teach, and how he continues to do through his disciples empowered by the Holy Spirit. Luke's story of earthly church is the story of dynamic word of the gospel which grows, spreads, and multiplies, resulting in new disciples and new churches. When we get to the end of Acts, and yet the story doesn't end. Paul is under house arrest waiting trial. Meanwhile, the unstoppable word continues to spread throughout the world. Luke's meaning is clear. The story continues through his readers who have the word, the Spirit, and the mandate to make disciples and plant churches. Throughout church history, we see this pattern continue. The word going out through ordinary people, disciples, and churches multiplying. While the Roman Empire was collapsing, God was calling a young man named Patrick. He lived in Roman Britain, but was kidnapped and sold into slavery by English traders. Alone and desperate, he cried out to God, who rescued him. He went on to form the Celtic missionary movement and was responsible for evangelizing and planting roughly 700 churches throughout Ireland first, and then in much of Europe over the next several centuries. 200 years after the Reformation, Protestants still had no plan or strategy to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. That was until God sent a young Australian nobleman to reform a bickering band of religious refugees. In 1722, Count Nicholas Zinzendorf opened his estate to the persecuted religious dissenters. Through his Christ-like leadership and power of the Holy Spirit, they transformed it into the first Protestant missionary movement, known as the Moravians. Leonard Dober and David Nitz-Shaman were the first missionaries sent out by the Moravians. They became the founders of the Christian movement. Among the slaves of the West Indies. For the next 50 years, the Moravians worked alone before any other Christian missionary arrived. By then, the Moravians had baptized 13,000 converts and planted churches on the Isle of St. Thomas, St. Croix, Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados, and St. Kitts. Within 20 years, Moravian missionaries were in the Arctic among the Inuit, in the southern Africa among the Native Americans of North America, in Suriname, Ceylon, China, India, and Persia. In the next 150 years, 2,000 Moravians volunteered to serve overseas. They went to the most remote, challenging, and neglected areas. This was something new in the expansion of Christianity. An entire Christian community, families as well as singles, devoted to world missions. When the American War of Independence broke out in 1776, most English Methodist ministers returned home. They left behind 600 members and a young English missionary named Francis Asbury, who was a disciple of John Wesley. Asbury had left the school before he turned 12 to become a blacksmith's apprentice. His grasp of Wesley's example, methods, and teaching enabled him to adapt them to his new mission field while remaining true to the principles. Methodism not only survived the Revolutionary War, it swept the land. Methodism under Asbury outstripped the strongest and most established denominations. In 1775, Methodists were only 2.5% of the total church membership in America. By 1850, their share had risen to 34%. This was at a time when Methodist requirements for membership were far stricter than under other denominations. Methodism was a movement. They believed that God was a dynamic force in the world, bringing salvation. They believed that God was powerfully and personally present in the life of every disciple, including African Americans and women, not just the clergy. They also believed it was their duty and priority to reach the lost people and to plant churches across the nation. American Methodism benefited greatly from the pioneering work of John Wesley and the English Methodists. Freed from the constraints of traditional English society, Asbury discovered that the Methodist movement was even more at home in a world of opportunity and freedom. As the movement spread through the labors of young traveling preachers, Methodism stayed cohesive through a well-defined system of community. Methodists remained connected with each other through a rhythm of class meetings, love fests, quarterly meetings, and camp meetings. By 1811, there were 400 to 500 camp meetings held each year with a total attendance of over 1 million. When Asbury died in 1816, there were 200,000 Methodists. By 1850, there was 1 million Methodists, led by 4,000 traveling preachers and 8,000 local preachers. The only organization more extensive was the U.S. government. Eventually, Methodism lost its passion and settled down to enjoy its achievements. In the process, it gave birth to the Holiness Movement. William Seymour was a holiness preacher with a desperate desire to know the power of God. He was the son of former slaves, a janitor, and blind in one eye. God chose this unlikely man to spark a movement that began in 1906 with a disused Methodist building on Azusa Street. The emotionally charged meetings ran all day and into the night. The meetings had no central coordination, and Seymour rarely preached. He taught people to cry out to God for sanctification, the fullness of the Holy Spirit, and divine healing. Immediately, missionaries fanned out from Azusa Street to the world. Within 2 years, they had brought Pentecostalism to parts of Asia, South America, and the Middle East, and Africa. They were poor, untrained, and unprepared. Many died in the field. Their sacrifices were rewarded. The Pentecostal charismatic and related movements became the fastest growing and most globally diverse expression of worldwide Christianity. At the current rate of growth, there will be 1 billion Pentecostals by 2025, most of them in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Pentecostalism is the fastest expanding movement, religious, cultural, or political, ever. Jesus founded a missionary movement and a mandate to take the gospel and multiply disciples in churches everywhere. History is replete with examples of movements just like the book of Acts. I have named only a few. 3 essential elements are necessary for movements: His dynamic word, the power of the Holy Spirit, and disciples who obey what Jesus has commanded. Chapter 24, next.